Okay, welcome everybody on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Rachel Podburn. I'm the Education Programs Manager at the museum. I'm pleased to welcome you to our discussion with Ben Lesser, a Holocaust survivor from Poland. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few words about the museum. Holocaust Museum LA is the first and oldest Holocaust survivor founded Holocaust museum in the United States. In the 1960s, a group of survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust. And this memorial eventually became Holocaust Museum LA. These survivors did so at a time when the community was by and large not ready to face this tragic history. Thanks to their courage and their foresight, these survivors established the first Holocaust museum in the United States with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. This morning, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Ben Lesser, who will share his story with you, as well as his daughter, Gail Lesser-Gerber, who will contribute as well. Ben is the founder of the Zachor Remembrance Foundation in Las Vegas, a nonprofit educational organization with a mission to educate about the Holocaust. After Ben shares his story, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. To those watching on Zoom, you can type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and those watching on Facebook can type your questions in the comments. He'll answer as many questions as possible. Thank you so much, Ben and Gail, for joining us this morning, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. I guess I'll go right into it. Yes, my friends, I come to you from an era in history where civilization lost its humanity, its heart, a time when there were only three kinds of people in the world. There were the killers, the victims, and the bystanders. The whole world, we found out now, knew what was going on in Europe, what was happening to the Jewish people, but no one said a word. They just kept quiet, giving Hitler carte blanche to do with the Jewish people whatever he wanted to do. And he did. So I'll tell you a little bit about my story. I come from a family of 7. My 2 brothers, my 2 sisters, my wonderful father, my mother. And out of all of the whole family, only 2 of us survived, myself and my sister Lola. We were the only 2 survivors. Unfortunately, Lola passed. She was in her mid-90s about 3 years ago. But after the Holocaust, she had a pretty good life. I lived in Krakow, Poland, on a major thoroughfare where they had a 3-story building in an apartment house, and we were on the ground floor, one of the apartments. Excuse me. We were on the ground floor, and one early in the morning, the whole building started to shake like an earthquake. So I ran to my window, which was the 3rd window on my left side now. To be pointing out, that was my bedroom window. I ran to the window, and what I saw were a bunch of tanks rolling down the streets. And following the tanks, there were half-tracks. And every few steps, a soldier would jump out of the half-track, get on the sidewalk, and this is how they occupied the city. There was no fighting. And following these half-tracks, there were the Wehrmacht, the foot soldier, with their shiny black boots and goose steps. It was quite impressionable for a 10-and-a-half-year-old. I wasn't quite 11 at that time. And we didn't know what to expect at that time. But my father gathered us kids together in the dining room, sat us on the chairs, and he said, okay, kids, from now on, you're all adults. You're all grown up. There are no more children. There'll be no whining. You're going to listen and you're going to obey. And this is what happened. From that point on, things started to happen. And on the 5th day after liberation of, the 5th day after occupation of Krakow, early in the morning at 5 a.m., a truck pulls up to our gate and they started to bang on the gate, truck full of soldiers. And the super came running out asking, well, what's going on? All they wanted to know where the Jewish people lived. And he was quick to oblige. He showed that the lessers, us, we lived on one side on the ground floor, and on the opposite on the ground floor, there was another young couple who had 2 daughters. They were younger than I, and the mother just gave birth to an infant little boy. They came running, breaking down the door to our apartment, and they came running in with sacks open in their hands, and they were pistol whipping us to get out of bed. It was 5 a.m., early in the morning. And they were yelling, throw in all your valuables, money, gold, silver, anything they can find of value, they were throwing it into those sacks. At the same time, beating up my mother, pulling off her jewelry, and my sister, my God. And they were beating up my father to open up the safe. While my father is opening the safe, we hear this tremendous screaming at our neighbor's apartment. So my sister Lola and I ran out through the back door to their kitchen door in the back. And this is when we came in, this is what we saw. We saw this monster was holding the baby infant by its legs and shaking it and screaming to the parents, make him shut up. The parents, the daughters were yelling, our baby, don't hurt our baby. With a smirk on his face, you can see he was enjoying what he was doing. He smashes the baby's head into a doorpost, killing it instantly. It's a memory that won't leave me. It's constantly with me, hearing that screaming baby in that sudden silence and what I saw on the floor. My God. How do you erase such a memory? It's always with me. Of course, when we saw that happening, every one of us in the room jumped on this monster. And as we jumped on him, his buddies from the other apartments, from our apartment, came running in, and they saw what was going on. So they pistol whipped all of us to get off him. And they were yelling to him, come on, Hans, let's go. And they picked up all of the valuables that they collected and put it in a sack and threw it in the truck and took off. That was only the 5th day after occupation of Krakow. From this point on, things started happening. New ordinances started coming in all the time. We had to wear the Star of David, and there was a we couldn't go out of the house or come in the house after certain hours, and people couldn't go to work, people couldn't travel, we couldn't leave the city. Everything happened, one new ordinance after another. And as it happened, it was so awful. We can't even explain it. There were no judges, no juries against the Jewish people. If you disobeyed any of their ordinances, there was only one punishment. And I guess you know what that is. Death. They simply shot you on the spot. And every morning there were dead bodies living, and people were going around to push carts and picking up these bodies. New ordinances started to come in. My father's business was wine and syrup, and he also had a chocolate factory. He was the first person in Poland to manufacture chocolate-covered wafers, something like Kit Kat, only shaped in little animals like bears and rabbits. Anyway, with tinfoil on it. I remember every day my father would come home, us kids would search his pockets, and he made sure there were some goodies in there. But it didn't last very long. They confiscated his chocolate factory, and then he went to his wine and syrup manufacturing, and there were guards stationed outside. They chased him away, confiscated. They wouldn't even let him go and take his briefcase. Imagine a man works all his life, and just like that, his livelihood is taken away. This has been going on, and things started getting worse. And then new ordinance came in that the Jewish people can no longer reside in Krakow. If you wanted to live in Krakow, they initiated, that was the first ghetto they made, a ghetto where the Jewish people could go into the ghetto, or they gave us a choice. You can go to a neighboring community, a small town outside of Krakow, but if you wanted to stay in Krakow, you have to go into the ghetto. Well, my father gave him a choice. Obviously, he chose to go to the ghetto. My sister Lola also had a suitor, a young man, Michael, who fell in love with her, and everybody knew. And he came to my father. He says, "Mr. Lesser, you know how I feel about Lola. Someday I'd love to marry her, but do me a favor and come to the same community that my parents are going." And my father, given the choice going to a ghetto or to a small community called Neapolomice, obviously he agreed. And Michael did all the arrangements. He arranged for a wagon, a driver, horse and buggy, and he helped us load. And that's when we found out that my father had 1,000 American dollars saved away for a rainy day. He put it in a safer in a Jewish prayer book, and he pasted it in there between the pages, and he put the book in with a whole bunch of Jewish literature in a sack. There were 2 sacks like this filled up, and we left. We left Krakow, and on the way we were being stopped. Halt! And 2 husky Nazis jump on the wagon. All they wanted to know, do you have any Jewish literature? And they saw 2 sacks full of books. They picked up those books and heaved it on the side of the road. They had a mountain full of books. There were every Jewish person who left Krakow, unless they went into the ghetto, had to pass this road. So they waited there, and then they confiscated all these books. They were going to have a bonfire afterwards. So my sister Lola spoke a beautiful German, and she walks up to this Nazi. She says, "Look, my father is a writer. He wrote his autobiography. Let him keep this one book." And he looks at her. Maybe he liked the way she spoke German. And he says, "Okay, we'll give you 5 minutes if you can find it." Imagine the whole family started to climb on the mountain of book. They all looked alike. They were black or brown, leather bound. You kept sliding down. After 5 minutes, he chased us away. Here's my father with the family. He had a family of 6. Actually, we were a family of 7. I didn't tell you that my oldest sister, Goldie, was in Munkacs, Hungary. My mother's side of the family comes from Munkacs, Hungary. And every summer, my mother would take us kids from Krakow to Munkacs to be with their family. And when the war broke out, my sister Goldie got stuck there. So she was safe, actually, in a country that was free. It wasn't occupied by the Germans. But the six of us here on the wagon going to a new community, Michael arranged for us, he rented a house for us, and he arranged for us to move into that farmhouse. He arranged that farmhouse. It was a house with a sash roof, and the farmer, an apple orchard farmer, lived on one side, and we lived on the other side. In between those two apartments, there was a baking oven. My future brother-in-law, Michael, when he saw what happened to my father, said everything, he has nothing left. How is he going to feed a family? He brought my father a sack full of flour, 100 pounds of flour, because in this house, there was a baking oven between the two apartments, our apartment and the farmer's apartment. That's the house, the farmhouse that we lived in. So when my father saw 100 pounds of flour, his face lit up. Why? He figured, Michael figured that he's going to be able to bake bread for the father, because in this baking oven, my father saw it, he realized, no, instead of baking bread, he started to bake pretzels. Why pretzels? All you need for pretzels is flour, water, and salt. Those ingredients he had. Then he took those pretzels to the neighboring bars and offered it for sale. It was a novelty. He started to sell the pretzels. Before you knew it, he became a little baker. He was making mandelbrot and challah and matzahs for Passover. He became a little baker. And my sister Lola marries Michael. And after she got married, this is my sister Lola and Michael, and this is the wedding guests that came into the yard from the house that we lived in. And you see all these people, there were more people that are not in the picture. Out of all of these people, only 3 of us survived. You see me here, that's me, my sister Lola, and Michael. Only the 3 of us survived. The rest of them were all slaughtered by the Nazis. This was my little brother. Okay, can you show the picture again? I would appreciate it. In the white suit, that's my little brother, Tuli, and my mother, he's next to my mother. And anyway, none of these people survived except I and Lola and Michael. After Lola and Michael moved out of the house, they moved into a duplex. The owner of the duplex happened to be the mayor of that community. And he lived on one apartment and Lola and Michael lived on the other one. One day he comes home, he says, Michael and Lola, I heard the rumors that there's going to be a raid against the Jewish people, either tonight or tomorrow night. Save yourselves. He saved us because Michael went out and he rented a wagon with a driver, horse and buggy and driver. And in the middle of the night, with whatever we could carry, we moved into this wagon. Now, the only place we could go was go to Bochnia. Bochnia was a ghetto not too far away from us. And Bochnia ghetto had a very bad reputation. Why? Every so often, 2 or 3 dump trucks would come into ghetto in the middle of the night, and the Nazis will go from house to house and pull out the kids from their beds and throw them into these trucks. You can just imagine the parents screaming for their babies screaming for their parents. And as they filled up 2 or 3 dump trucks, they would start to pull out of the ghetto. Obviously, the parents were running behind these trucks and screaming for their children, but these cultured people had machine guns at the end of the truck, and they would mow down the parents running behind these trucks. Now, this resonated throughout Europe. Everyone knew, stay away from Bochnia ghetto because of these atrocities. But we had no choice. And it's a good thing we did leave, because the night after, there was a raid in Nyepolomice, and trucks were coming in, dozens of trucks. They were pulling out all the Jewish people and taking them to the forest. The men were given shovels. They had to dig their own grave, and everyone was lined up and shot. How do we know this? After the war, Lola and I survived. We went to Nyepolomice to find out what happened to all the people. The farmers were telling us that these were farmers who were selling berries and mushrooms in the market. They would go in the forest early in the morning to pick these mushrooms and berries, and they saw these trucks come in. They were hiding behind trees, and they saw what happened. And they said that the ground was moving 3 days later after people were shot. Anyway, this is how we found out. So it was good that we left. But now in Bochnia, we came into the ghetto and we didn't know where to go when Michael sees one of his school buddies. His name was Farber. And he says, Farber says to him, Michael, what are you doing here? So Michael is telling him the story, what happened. So they had to move out from Nyepolomice. So Farber says, Michael, and to my parents, don't worry, we'll find you a place. He found a place for Michael and his family, an apartment, and he took myself, my little brother, my father, and my mother to another apartment where there were 8 people besides us. There were now we were 12, a dozen in one big room. That's all it was a room. There was no water, running water, obviously nothing of the sort. And there was an outhouse. It was, don't ask, the conditions in there. In the house, there were no beds. In the apartment, there were no beds. All we had is straw on the ground, and there were blankets on top of the straw, and there were blankets separating, every family separating with blankets. There were some broken up furniture, a little stove, a table, boxes for chairs. And there was one piece of furniture that stood out. It was an ornate armoire where you hang your jackets and coats. But I didn't pay attention, but it was little out of place because all this junky furniture. I didn't pay attention to this. But everyone in the ghetto had to work. And my job was, I worked in a uniform factory, sewing on buttons on uniforms. If you didn't work, you didn't get any rations. So everyone had to work. And of course, my little brother didn't work, but we all supported him with our food. And it was barely enough for one person to eat, not long for a whole family. All I can tell you is this lasted for about a year. And then after that, Farber, that friendly policeman, they called them capos, comes to Michael and says, Michael, I heard there's going to be a rumor, there is going to be a raid tonight or tomorrow night. Well, save yourselves, hide. Ever since those trucks would come in and pick up the children from their beds, every apartment in every house had a hiding place. They called them bunkers. So that's when I found out that our bunker was this ornate piece of furniture where you hang your coats. Where you hang your coats, you open the door, you push the coats and jackets apart, the back panel would slide apart and there was a hole in the wall and all 12 of us could crawl through that hole. The last person would then close the door and put the clothing back in place. He would close the back panel and we stayed on the other side of the wall between two buildings. It was freezing cold and snowing. Now, lucky for us, the outside of the buildings were connected. Only the ceilings, the roof, were open between the two of us and it was snowing. And we were freezing all night long and we heard shootings, dogs barking and people screaming. We heard dogs tearing our neighbors apart. It was awful. Towards morning, it got quiet. When it got quiet, we decided to come out. And when we came out, we went outside the house, the apartment. We couldn't believe what we saw. Bodies laying in the snow all over the place. People torn apart by dogs. A woman holding a baby, you can hardly recognize them. They were torn apart by dogs. And there were people going around with push carts and picking up these bodies and pieces of bodies and piling it on push cart. And then they would take them to the ghetto square and they would pile them up as high as they could. And these cultured people would come with gasoline cans and pour over the bodies, and they started a human bonfire in Bochnia Ghetto Square. Can you imagine that? Flaming people in Bochnia Ghetto Square. I'll never forget this sight of this and the smell. Now, my sister Lola and her family, had a place to hide. Lola and Michael were hiding somewhere else, but they had a place to hide in a doghouse. You heard me right, in a doghouse. And Lola and Michael hid in a water tower over a tanning factory with Farber's sister and her two children. And they were knee-high in water and freezing. And they were there all night hearing the same thing as we hear, screaming, shooting, dogs barking. Towards the morning, Farber came and he knocked on the tank. He says, okay, the coast is clear. You can come out now. Excuse me. And Lola and Michael came out and they got a little more circulation back into their legs. The first thing they wanted to know is go to the doghouse to see what happened to his family. And when they came to the doghouse, this is what they found. Everyone was shot. Everyone was laying on the grass. There they are. By the way, these pictures were all drawn by my sister Lola. She was a beautiful artist, and she drew these pictures from memory in 1950. So it was like 5 years after the war. The whole family laying in the snow with a bullet hole in their head. Marika, the little Michel's little sister, still holding a doll that Lola made her for her birthday. And of course, Michel, knowing he is a religious man and knowing what we had to do with his family, of course, Lola started to scream and Michael told her, no, you can't because they're still burning there, they're gonna hear you. But he knew what we had to do. According to Jewish religion, you're supposed to bury your loved ones within, I believe, 24 or 72 hours, the latest. So he went out, he found a rickety wheelbarrow, he put his family. You can see Marika still holding the doll, and Lola is holding them down, and they're wheeling him to the cemetery. The cemetery, they found a shovel and they dug a grave and they buried the whole family. A lot more happened there in between, but I don't have the time to tell you. But then afterwards, Lola and Michael went back to their apartment and they were holding each other and crying. When they heard people going around with microphones, loudspeakers, and yelling, everyone who is alive in the ghetto has to go to the Judenrat and register. Now they had to register or else they wouldn't get any rations, any food. Okay, from this point on, my dear friends, there's a whole story how my family and Michael and Lola were, along with another 50 or 55 people, were able to get out of the ghetto. This is a very long story. It has to do, some of it, help of a Nazi soldier, Nazi commandant. Anyway, the whole story is so big that I can't continue and make my whole story in 1 hour. So I'm going to have to skip. We're now outside the ghetto, the whole family, and we're in an apartment when Michael approaches a truck driver who was hauling coal, and he was offering him, if you can make your truck into a double-decker where people can hide in between the coal and the chassis, we will pay a lot of money and then take us to the Czech border, Polish-Czech border, and we will have a smuggler waiting for us there. And he agreed. He agreed to do that. He made a double decker. Now, between the coal and the chassis, 10 people could hide. This picture that you see here, I'll tell you a little later, but actually it was when they found out about this truck and they had, my parents were in there and everybody was pulled out of the truck, including the driver who wasn't Jewish. They were all lined up and everyone was shot. That's another story, but right now we're on our way. There were 10 of us who were, Lola and Michael went first because we couldn't always trust the driver that he would take us to the border. Sometimes they would take your money and then they would take you to the Gestapo or the SS, and they get paid again for turning in Jewish people. So we couldn't trust them. That's why Michael and Lola decided to go with a group of other 8 people, a total 10, and they left. And when the driver came back 2 days later with the right passport, then we knew we can go in. And this was time for me and my little brother. My oldest brother, who was forging some papers, he was found and he was killed. Now, the only one left was Lola, Michael, myself, my little brother, my mother, father, and my sister Goldie in Munkacs, Hungary. So anyway, we are leaving Bochnia. About an hour out of Bochnia, we're being stopped, halt, and we see through the cracks of the trucks, there were soldiers, there were rifles standing, and they were talking to the driver. We couldn't hear because of the roar of the engine. I couldn't understand what they were talking. And we were sure somebody turned us in, they're gonna kill us. And meanwhile, the truck started to move. when the truck moved, we felt a little easier. Oh, they're letting us go. But when we look through the cracks, we see on one step next to the driver, there's a soldier with a rifle. On the other step, there's a soldier with a rifle. Now we hear soldiers walking on top of the coal, and the coal dust comes down. My little brother is about to sneeze, and I'm holding his nose in his mouth. And we were sure we were being taken to a cemetery or to a forest to be shot. After an hour, the truck stops, and all of a sudden we hear, Dankeschön, Dankeschön. All they did is they just hitchhiked. And imagine, they were on top of the coal, Nazi soldiers, and they didn't know that there were 10 Holocaust people, 10 Jewish people hiding inside that truck. It was a miracle. Anyway, about 2 hours later, he came to a forest. It was nighttime, and he told us to go through this um, um, tool shed. Inside the tool shed, there is a inside the tool shed, there is a man who is going to cross you into the border, a spun who's going to cross you into the border. And it turned out he was a forest ranger, and he was the smuggler who was going to smuggle us across. From this point, there is a long story also. All I can tell you is we were laying on our floor. It was 3 a.m. and watching the guards go up and down the hill with their dogs. And at 3 a.m., the guards came down and they were going to exchange fresh guards to go up on the hill. And during that little ceremony, there was time for us to cross the border. And the smuggler took us, we shimmied our way up quietly. He picked up the barbed wire. He says, cross. Now, no, once you're on the other side, don't let yourself fall because there was a steep mountain. Just sit down and hold hands and slide down. Otherwise, if you tumble, they're going to hear you and it's all over. So we did that. We sat down. It was pitch black. You couldn't see a hand in front of you. And we were holding each other and we sliding down the mountain. There was a plateau on the bottom. We hit the plateau. I asked my little brother, are you okay? He says, yes, he's all right. When all of a sudden, somebody pitches me on my shoulder, and I jumped out of my skin. He says, Beinisch. Now, no one called me by that name except my immediate family, my parents and my brothers and sisters. He says, I'm your Uncle Belo, your mother's brother. I'm going to take you to Hungary. We'll save you. How in the world did you so know where to find me? It's pitch black. You don't see your hand in front of you. He says that Lola and Michael went through the couple days earlier and they contacted him and they told him exactly the spot. So he was waiting there for us and he's going to take us across. Well, it's a long story because we had to cross another border from Czechoslovakia to Hungary. All I can tell you, it's too long of a story, but when we did arrive to Budapest, and when we came to Budapest, my sister Lola and Michael met us at the airport and went God at the train station. And we went to their house. We had a good meal, but we had to do other things to be legalized in Hungary. Since we were underage, my uncle had to vouch for us, so he'd take us to jail and put us in jail for 15 minutes and then bail us out. So he's going to be our voucher. He's going to take care of us. Okay, so anyway, and the next day we went to Munkac. Overnight we were going to Munkac. When we arrived to Munkac, I see my sister Goldie and my grandparents, my uncles, my cousins, the whole mishpucha, everybody was out there waiting for us. And I tell them what's happening in Poland. Now, most of them didn't believe. My family believed us, but they said this will never happen in Hungary because Hungary is an ally of Germany. Now, why would Hitler siphon off soldiers from the front to occupy a friendly country? It didn't make sense, and it did make sense. But my uncle invited me and my little brother to live in his house. He was a very wealthy man. He had a store. He was a yardage goods store. And above the store, there was his house. And he invited me to stay here with his sons. And I told my uncle, I says, Uncle, you know, if the Germans ever came into Hungary, all of your valuables will be confiscated. It would make sense if you can exchange some of your valuables into diamonds or jewels or something we can put in our pockets or hide it under our body. He listened to us. One day he comes home with boxes full of shoes, beautiful black shoes. And he tells a pair of shoes for every member of the family. And he tells every member in the family, know that in the heels of these shoes, there are diamonds. Use it only in a life-threatening situation if you can save your life, but be aware of it. So, of course, there was freedom, and we were waiting for our parents to come, and they were supposed to follow a few days later. They never came. And a couple of months later, someone came from Poland, and he told us what happened to our parents. One of the Polish farmers saw what was going on. They called the Gestapo. They came. Everyone was pulled out of the truck and lined up as shot. So, but meanwhile, in Hungary, there is freedom. And we had a taste of freedom for a few months. And all of a sudden, taste of freedom a few months, all of a sudden, the Nazis come in. In March of 1944, they just marched right in like they were invited guests. And it didn't take them long. Right away, they started with the Jewish people making ghettos. You had to wear Star of David. And within a few weeks, they were already transporting Jews to the death camps. So imagine, it's too long of a story to tell you, but they marched us to the railroad station. At the railroad station, they put us in cattle cars, 82 cattle car. And we're on our way someplace to Germany. They told us that Germany needs workers and that able-bodied people will be working in Germany. Children will be schooled, older people will be cared for. Bring along all your valuables, but leave everything else behind. Bring along your valuables that you can carry only. And people believed them, and they were dragging their suitcases, their bundles, and 82 cattle car. It was so tight that it wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the fact that everyone had a bundle. Now it was so tight that if somebody wanted to sit down, someone else had to stand up. In the corner of that cattle car, they had 2 buckets of water, and once the water was gone, of course, there were no sanitary facilities. There were no toilets. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, imagine the buckets were filled up and they were overflowing. Now we were happy we were sitting on the bundles instead of the floor where human waste was all over the place. 3 days of this misery without food, or the water disappeared right away. People were dying, people were screaming. You can't imagine. I can't describe it all in a few minutes. But we arrived at a place, it was nighttime, and we see lit up on a station that says Oświęcim. Oświęcim was Polish for Auschwitz. We didn't know about Auschwitz. We had no idea what it is. But the train stops and we see a gate, and on top of the gate it says Arbeit macht frei. Labor gives you freedom. And the train didn't stay there long, and then it started to move another 3 kilometers, and that was Birkenau. That was the gate that you saw. We were arrived at nighttime to Birkenau. In Birkenau, the doors open up and all hell breaks loose. We hear dogs and the Nazis screaming, raus, raus, schnell. And there were other people there yelling in different languages with striped clothes. Leave all your belongings where it is. Don't you pick up anything. Women and children to the right, and man to the left. I'm holding on to my little brother and my sister, Goldie, and we were just pulled apart, never to see each other again. I had no idea. They were taken directly to the gas chambers. I don't have to tell you what happened there in Auschwitz. It's unbelievable. I went with my uncle and my cousin for some reason because I was 15 and a half and I wasn't a man and I wasn't a child either. But I decided to go with the men, figuring that if we're going to work, they're going to feed us better. But nothing, no one in our mind we can think of killing. Anyway, but as we come forward, I see a man in a white frock, and he's holding on a white glove, going left, right, left, right, left, right. And I come close, and he asks the young man, "Kannst du 5 kilometers laufen? Can you run 5 kilometers? Or would you rather go by train?" And he says, "Well, I would rather go by not by train, by truck. I'm sorry." So it didn't make sense to me. Why would he ask such a question of a young man? So I figured he's testing them if they are strong enough to work. So I tell my uncle, I spoke German, I tell my uncle, "Let me go first. And whatever he asks you, tell him, yes, you can run, you can walk, you can work, you're healthy. Let me go first." I went first and I came in front. This person was Dr. Mengele, the angel of death. And he was pointing his finger at me. When I came towards him, I said, 18 Jahre alt, gesund und arbeitsfähig. I'm 18 years old, I'm healthy and I can work. And he asked me, "Kannst du 5 kilometers laufen?" I says, "Jawohl, yes." And he sent me to the left, my uncle and cousin went to the left too. I'm almost running out of time. But all I can say is that from this point on, what we went through in Auschwitz is unbelievable. We saw in Auschwitz actually children and infants that are being thrown into fiery pits alive. And that's, the fire pits was only 3 barracks away from where we were housed. This was going on day and night, the screaming and yelling. You can just imagine what we went through. 2 weeks we went through in Auschwitz, and after that they loaded us in trucks and they took us to a labor camp called Dachau. The labor camp was a rock quarry, and all we did in the rock quarry is, as they dynamited the mountain, it was our job to break up the big boulders into manageable pieces, throw it into mining carts and run it down the hill to be grounded. So it was very hard work, and I knew my uncle is not going to survive it. So I bribed the chef in the kitchen with my diamonds to give my uncle a job. By the way, my uncle's and my cousin's shoes were all taken away in Auschwitz. I didn't have time to tell you about this, but I refused to give up my shoes, and I was lucky I had the diamonds. So the kitchen chef gave my uncle a job in the kitchen. It was easier for him. And every day as we came home from work, they lined us up in the yard, 5 in a row, and even the kitchen help had to come out to be counted. And everyone was counted. And after they counted us, they would dismiss us. We would go for our ration and go to sleep, take a shower, whatever. But one day we come home and they count and they count and they count. They wouldn't let us go. And the commandant comes down with his Fräulein, his girlfriend. He says, I'm going to show the Schweinhund a lesson, something they'll never forget. What happened? 3 of our inmates escaped. And because of this, he orders his henchmen to pull out every 10th person in line to receive 25 lashes. And as they're pulling out every 10th person in line, I can see that my uncle is going to be at 10. I push him behind me and I took his place. So they put us 10 on the yard, and they had the bundles of steak, hardwood steaks, about 3 feet long. And the henchmen are bringing down a horse, what do they call it? So bringing down a sawhorse, I believe that's what they call it. Yeah, a sawhorse. And this is what they ordered us to do. Tiptoe, bend over the sawhorse. One man was pulling our trousers like a drum, and the other one was hitting. You had to count out loud. If you miscounted, they start from 1 again. If your heels touch the ground, you start from 1 again. If your stomach touches the 2x4 on the sawhorse, you start from 1 again. It was impossible. I was number 4. The first one went up, and as they started to hit him, one man was holding his trousers tight and he was screaming, 1, 2, 3. And every time they hit him, you can see a line of blood coming right through the trousers. They hit you so hard with those sharp stakes. Anyway, he fell apart. He miscounted and he touched the ground. Don't ask. He fell apart and he fell down. And he falls down. The commandant goes over, pulls out, it kicks him in the face. Get up. He couldn't. He pulls out the revolver and he shoots him right in the temple. His girlfriend walks over to him, gives him a hug and a kiss, like he just performed a heroic act. He killed a man. Then this number 2 man came down the same way. He couldn't make it. He fell apart. He goes over, shoots him. Number 3 was a little younger, and he was screaming out, please have mercy on me, don't kill me. So the commandant says, then get up and walk over to me here and face me. The poor guy gets up, makes 4 or 5 steps, and his knees gave out under him, and he falls. As soon as he falls, he pulls out the guns and shoots him. Ben Lesser is next in line. I am number 4. And all I remember, I walk up to this sawhorse, I tiptoe, I bend over, and I said to myself, Ben, this is it. If you want to live another 10 minutes, you have to do exactly what he tells you. No ifs or buts. And bend over, one man is pulling my trousers right, the other one starts to hit. And I yell, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Finally, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, I made it. You can, when I made it, you can hear a pin drop in that camp because no one believed that anyone could survive this. But the man who was pulling my trousers says to me in Yiddish, go over and thank him. So I stand up, blood is running down my legs. I walk over to him, I salute him, and I say, Dankeschön, Herr Kommandant. When he hears that, he puts his arm on my collar, on my shirt collar. He twists me towards the number 10s who are still to be beaten. He says, now I told you it could be done. If you do it like this, Junge, if you do it like this, young one, you have nothing to worry about. While this is going on, there's a commotion at the gate. They caught those 3 inmates and they were pulling them in. Well, you couldn't recognize them, bloodied black and blue. And when the commandant saw that, just like a child gets sick in a toy and throws it away, he tells all us 10 to go back in our line. And he tells his henchmen to bring down a portable gallows. They had a single gallows, and he orders his henchmen to hang those 3 men one at a time. And we all had to watch in line. If you dared to close your eyes, you got whipped. So you had to watch. I'll never forget the 3rd man must have been religious. As they put the noose around his neck, he says, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. But when they heard it, they wouldn't let him finish Adonai Echad, the last 2 words. They kicked the stool out from under him. They wouldn't let him finish. They were such sadists, you can't imagine. Now, afterwards, they dismissed us like nothing ever happened. And we went to our barrack. For weeks, I could not lay on my back. I had to lay on my stomach because of the welts that I had on my back. Now, one night, we heard cannon fire. All night long, cannon fire. The front was closing in. When we reported to go to work, there's a loudspeaker saying, no one is reporting to work today. You're all being evacuated. The camp is being evacuated. Line up in rows of 5s and march out. They lined us up in rows of 5. My cousin and I are next to each other. My uncle was already in the kitchen working, so we couldn't even say goodbye to him. This is the last time we've seen him. And now we're marching on our death march. They call it the death march because if you could not keep up pace with the soldiers, you were shot. And all day long, you can hear pop, pop, people were being shot constantly. We were marching 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I thought it was 3 weeks. I had a professor in Germany correct us. He wrote us to my daughter. He says, he read my book. He says, your father made a mistake in this book. He said he marched them 3 weeks. He actually marched 7 weeks, 450 kilometers from Dachau to Buchenwald. We were just like zombies. All I can tell you, most of our people were shot, killed. The last 3-4 days, all our shoes fell apart. So we were now walking barefooted on the snow, marching. And we arrived in Buchenwald. They count us and they tell us to go into this barrack and they're gonna feed you. You can take a shower, but tomorrow morning, at a certain time, you better be in the same place because Buchenwald is also being evacuated. There's a whole story about this picture that was taken while I was in the showers in Buchenwald. But I don't have time to talk about it right now, which they did. They fed us and gave us fresh uniforms, shoes, and all that. And the next morning we went there, we're lined up, and they counted us and they walked us out from the camp. About 300 yards outside the camp, there were cattle cars waiting for us. They lined us up in 80 to a cattle car, and they tell us to go in. I push my cousin, who can hardly move anymore. I push him up first, and I says, find a place against the wall so we can rest our back against the wall. I remember going to Auschwitz, and I was in the middle, people all around me. It was terrible. So he went in first, and he found us a spot, and he was holding an area for me. When I came in, we had a good spot against the wall, and there we were standing there. They closed the car. An hour later, they opened up the doors and they threw in 80 breads, a bread for each person. Picture this. Those people who were next to the door were grabbing 4 or 5 breads. I and my cousin had nothing. We were against the wall. I knew I had to get a bread, so I started to climb over the heads of the sitting inmates to see if I can wrestle out the bread from somebody who had many. And as I'm climbing, one inmate had a pocket knife and he stabs me. I feel a stab in my throat and I feel blood in my mouth, but I can't let go. I need to get a bread. And I come up, this man had 4 or 5 breads. I pull out one bread, I put it in my back pocket and I run back to my cousin. And I came back to my cousin. He says, Ben, what's happening? You're bleeding. I put my finger here and went right through my tongue. I have this gash. You can still see it today, but not obviously on Zoom. It's over my chin bone now because I filled up and it was so skinny. I was in the middle of my throat. All right, how I survived. 1 week, 2 weeks, I rationed that bread between my cousin and myself, giving each middle of the night a piece the size of a half an egg. And it lasted us 2 weeks. And everybody around us is dying. Even those people who had 4 or 5 breads, they didn't have any liquid to digest it with. They were dying. Everyone is dying. I don't know, we're still alive. 1 week after we run out of bread, we're still traveling, being shuttled back and forth. And after 3 weeks, we arrive at a place called Dachau. They open up the gate and they say, anyone can walk out, walk through the tracks into the gate of Dachau. And we, only out of our wagon, out of 80, I don't think more than 4 or 5 of us walked out. And my cousin and I were 2 of them. So the rest of them were all dead. That was called the death train. It was known. And when we arrived into Dachau, I didn't know it then, but I found out later that there were only 18 out of 6,000 that were able to come out alive. The rest were, everybody was dead. Imagine 3 weeks without food or water. Even those had food, they died anyway, they had no water. So we walked into the camp of Dachau and we see mountains full of dead bodies. Apparently, the Nazis ran out of coal to burn the bodies in the crematorium, so they piled them up as high as they could, and they put me and my cousin into a barrack right next to the crematorium, next to these bodies. They didn't give us a bunk. We just lay there. What, 1 day, 2 days. On the 3rd day, we hear Befreiung, Befreiung, liberation, Americans, Americans. I tell my cousin, let's go out and see. And we're holding each other, going out. We see these inmates are crawling on their hands and knees and kissing the boots of the GIs. They looked like gods to us. They came to liberate us. Imagine, we're free. And I go in the middle of the yard, 2 GIs come up to us and they had a can of Spam. They open it up and it smelled so good and they handed it to me. We made a mistake. We ate some of it. Both of us came down with dysentery. That night, my cousin dies in my arm with dysentery. The night after, the night of liberation, he dies in my arm. And I keep talking to him. I wouldn't let him go. When they saw that, they came and took him away. When they took him away, I followed. I made about 5 or 7 steps and my knees gave out and I fell. The minute I fell, they put me to a wall there against the wall. I lay there for a few hours and then suddenly some nicely dressed man comes up to me and he introduces himself in a broken German. And he asked me what languages I speak, and I told him the languages. He said, Polish? I'm from Poland. I'm a Jesuit priest who came here with the nuns and doctors from Paris, and we're building a camp, a building here in the yard of Dachau to house your survivors. So I'm going to take you there to infirmary. I'm going to take you there. And he picks me up like a bag of bones, which I was. I was only weighing maybe 50 or 55, maybe mostly 60 pounds. I don't know. And he put me on his shoulder and he walks with me to the infirmary. I'll never forget what he told me. He says, Benek, it was terrible what they did to Jewish people. The only crime they committed is that they were born Jewish. You were born Jewish. How terrible. However, Benek, don't you ever abandon your noble religion. To hear that from a Jesuit priest in 1945 was unheard of. I'll never forget it. You may hear it today, but not then. So he took me into the infirmary and none was there. They put me on a cot with a white sheet. She took my vitals and I passed out. 2.5 months later, I wake up in a monastery called St. Tertullian. The monks gave up one building to make it into a hospital for the survivors. And this is where I woke up 2.5 months later. To tell you the story from this point on would take me another hour, but it's so interesting. You have to find out. And I can only tell you, since I don't have the time, if you read my book, it would help a lot. You'll find out what happened to me afterwards, because I was supposed to go to Palestine at the time and reclaim the land from Judea, from where we were dispersed. And instead, I met my sister, and how I met her, unbelievable. And now we have a wonderful family. This is my sister Lola and her sons, 2 sons and a daughter. And that's her family. Lola passed away already. So to spite Hitler, we were able to survive and start a new family. Please, if you have any questions, if there's enough time, Rachel, thank you for putting up with me. I think I went up over the hour, but I couldn't help it. Normally, my story takes over 2 hours. So thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. I know it was an honor for me to hear your story, and I'm sure everyone who's listening in and watching feels the same way. And I want to thank you for taking the time to come speak with us today. We do have a few questions in the Q&A box. One viewer asked, were you able to sleep during the death march?
Yes, they put us usually in barns they made the arrangements with the farmers in advance in a barn where we would sleep on straw and hay. Yeah, we were able to sleep.
After experiencing this, how do you trust people again, or how did you learn to trust people again?
Well, I I feel that people are honorable, and most people you can trust. There are a few who are not, but make sure if you trust someone to that you're choosing the right person, because unfortunately there are some who would like to see the Holocaust all over again, and they're doing everything humanly possible um, to reverse that. Thank you.
Thank you. What happened to your uncle?
We never heard what happened to our uncle. We never saw him again. So I imagine they had some ideas with the kitchen help that did something else. They either killed him or sent him to Auschwitz to be gassed. Who knows?
How old were you at the time of liberation?
At the time of liberation, I was 16. When the war began, I was only 11. From actually those 6 or 7 years, I went through hell on earth.
Have you returned to Europe since you were liberated and since you came to the US?
Yes, I returned several times. I went to the March of the Living, and I had my family. I took them and I showed them the places where I lived, and I showed them places in Krakow. And we went to the cemetery where my mother and father are buried in Bochnia. Um, because one of these couples, one of the policemen who had buried my family, he was ordered to bury him in a mass grave. He told us later where it was, and we were able to put up monuments. Yes.
Did you meet your wife in Europe or after coming to the US?
No, no. After coming to the US, that's the story in itself, the beautiful America that we came to, and how I was able, how I worked hard for the first years. And there were times where actually I was on Skid Row in Los Angeles, and how I was able to turn my life around and then change my life and find my wonderful wife. We're now married over 71 years and we're still together.
Did prisoners ever help one another at risk of their life um, and help each other in any way?
Usually prisoners couldn't help, or they'll help you, like help you walking, that they would do, but they couldn't help with food or anything else because they were all starving.
At what point did you start to talk about your experience?
Okay, at first, I in America, I did not talk about my experience because I wanted my kids to grow up as regular American citizens. I made sure they went to public school, mingling with all nationalities. They had all these friends, but somehow they knew that I was a survivor, but they didn't question me. But when my grandson in 5th grade called me up and said, Papa, my teacher heard that you're a survivor. Please come out and tell your story. I would appreciate it. That's when I started talking. I couldn't hide it anymore. My kids were grown-ups, they had children of their own, and it was time. And so I went the first time to a fifth grade school. But remember, I had many feelings. What do you tell fifth graders? Will I give them nightmares? Will they, what? But as it turned out, it's unbelievable. Those fifth graders couldn't stop asking questions, and they gave up their lunchtime to keep asking me questions.
One person wrote in and asked me to share. She said, "You are my inspiration, and thank you on behalf of our generation for sharing your story with such great detail." And
All right, thank you for listening to my story. But what you heard was only maybe 10 or 15% of my story. We only have an hour, so we had to shorten it. I strongly recommend that you find out the rest of the story.
and one person watching asked if you can share the name of your book so that they can go find it.
Yeah, the name of the book is, in fact, I'll do something better. Show you. Are you there? The name of the book, hello? Are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, the name of the book is Living a Life That Matters, From Nazi Nightmare to American Dream. And this was me and me now, okay? Good book. I highly recommend it.
One of the people watching says his father-in-law was one of the first Jewish American soldiers to come through the gate of Dachau as a liberator, and wants to know if you remember the moment where the American soldiers came in and liberated Dachau.
Absolutely, of course I remember. They looked like gods to us. They were liberating us. They gave us freedom. You can't imagine. I mean, our survivors were crawling on their hands and knees and kissing the boots of the GIs. Of course, I don't remember individual people, but my God, yes, I do remember.
Do you ever have nightmares about your experience?
The answer is yes. Not so much lately, but especially after I speak like today, chances are that next night I would have nightmares. But at the beginning, it was very bad. My wife would calm me down every night when I was sometimes screaming in the middle of the night. Yes, we do have nightmares.
Oh, I think we have run our time. So I want to say thank you so much to everyone for attending today's Survivor Talk with Ben Lesser. And thank you again to Ben and Gail for joining us today to share Ben's story. For more information about Holocaust Museum LA and our future programs, please visit holocaustmuseumla.org. And for more information about the Zachor Remembrance Foundation, which Ben founded, you can visit zachorfoundation.org. Holocaust Museum LA is now open to the public, and you can make a reservation on our website to come visit. But we also are continuing virtual programs, so stay tuned for future virtual programs as well. And thank you everyone for joining today.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
It was good.